Hey, y'all, and welcome to another episode on this journey of self-discovery where we try to go through ancient texts and we try to go through scientific knowledge to try to figure out what is actually true and what's a half-truth or misinformation. Today, we're going to talk about astronomia. And astronomia is actually what they used to refer to as astrology and astronomy put together back in the day. There was no separation between the two until about the 17th or 18th century. The reason why we're going to talk about astrology or astronomy, whichever you want to use, we're going to use them interchangeably today, is because it is the oldest science that is in existence. It actually dates back to ancient Egypt. So there are a lot of philosophers and scientists that believe that there is a relationship between what is happening in this realm and what is happening in the cosmos, as above, so below, right? Which really translates to the above is as the below is as the above, right? But I'm going to say as above, as so below. There has been a lot of study when it comes to the cosmos and trying to make correlations to what is actually happening on this earth. And astronomy and astrology actually play a huge part of that. So what I want to talk about today is what kind of separates them as we know them today. And then I want to talk about the history of astrology and astronomy. And I also want to talk about the great philosophers who came before us who tried to wake us up to some of this knowledge. Now, the difference between this episode and our next episode is that this is what we can find scientifically. This is what we can find by doing research. Next episode, we're going to get into this book called Astro Worship, and it's by J.H. Hill. And basically, he actually believed in syncretism. He believed that there was a connection between religion and philosophy. There was a connection between Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, all of those religions together, but also with what their relationship is to the cosmos. And he tried to bridge the gap between them. This was back, I think he wrote this book in 1895. So he did this by studying the ancient texts and stuff like that. So with this episode, I just want to talk about what we know and what we can find. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk about the correlations between what we know and what we can find. Okay. Let's start by defining astrology and astronomy and then talking about their differences as we know them in today's time. And then we'll move on to what we know because of our findings through history, through excavating certain areas and finding, old bones and, old books and all of that. And then we'll get into the ancient philosophers and we'll get into periods of time where we saw advancements in astrology and astronomy. Okay. So astronomy is the study of objects and phenomenon originating beyond Earth's atmosphere. So in short, what that means is astronomy is the study of the universe. It's study of the cosmos. It's study of space and time. It's the study of stars, constellations, ecliptics, the retrograde motion and forward motion of constellations and stars and all of that. Okay. Whereas astrology makes predictions based off of the position of those celestial objects, right? Based off of the work that astronomy does. Now, astronomy is meant to help us understand the physics of the universe. Astronomers come up with the mathematical positions and calculations of the celestial bodies in the sky. Then astrologers use mathematic calculations to determine the position of planets, stars, constellations, ecliptics, and they try to correlate astrological aspects and sign positions with events that are happening on Earth and that are happening in an individual's life. Okay, so you'll see me looking down a little bit, guys. Just understand that this is a lot of information. I got the mind of a fucking fish.
Dory. What are you doing? What are you doing? Are you sure you speak whale?
So I did write this down and I did take notes. So I'm just, giving you what I found through my own studies. You'll be able to look at everything that I looked at because I'm going to do a reference page at the end of each episode to tell you where I'm getting my information. So you guys can go and look for this as well. Okay. So if you see me looking down, that's why. Now, astrology is practiced geocentrically, which means that Earth is at the center of this. And astronomers believe that the universe has no center, per like the Big Bang Theory. So that's a clear distinction between the two. Astronomers study the stars and planets, while astrologers use the position of the stars and planets to determine an individual's future and personality. Now, astronomers believe that there is no evidence to support what astrologers are doing because you would have to interview everybody and people would have to be in touch with what they are feeling and the different energies. And it's hard for you to prove that astrology actually is a thing, but it is an ancient belief and practice. So I want us to explore it. Okay. Now, there is a system called the Myers-Briggs system, which is a personality test. It's often used by like school counselors. You might have done the Myers-Briggs test when you were in school, when you're in trying to find your career, because usually career counselors use this a lot. And the Myers-Briggs personality test actually incorporates the 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth, in order to determine what your personality is. However, this Myers-Briggs system actually has not been accepted by a lot of psychologists who are the scientists who study personalities. Okay. So a lot of them don't actually use this method, but there are people throughout history who have made the correlation between that everything is connected. Okay. So both astrologers and astronomers believe that Earth plays a pivotal role in the solar system and that Earth and the universe are one, but they just have 2 completely different perspectives on how that works and what that is. Now, astronomers are actually accepted as scientists, and all of their findings have to be able to be reproduced regardless of how they feel personally. While astrologers believe that the cosmos have metaphysical and divine essences that influence individuals and world events, but there has not been any solid proof of that, because again, it's hard for you to provide proof from every individual person on what they're experiencing at that time. Consciousness is something that's experienced on the inside, and it's hard to find proof of that. Okay. It's like thinking a thought and somebody trying to find proof of where that thought came from. Let's talk about kind of like the historical path of astrology and astronomy. And let's talk about like some of the findings that we found throughout history. Okay. Whether it be through books, whether it be through caves and hieroglyphs, whether it be through bones that we have found, all of that. Okay. And then we're going to move forward and talk about, events in astrology that helped advance astrology. And then we're going to talk about philosophers that we need to know about. Okay. So about 34,000 years ago in the Stone Age, observers recorded the cycle of the moon on pieces of bone and antlers. We know this because we actually found the bones and the antlers, and we're able to predate back when the bones and antlers actually had life in them, meaning like when they were in existence, when these animals existed. Okay. So that told us that they actually watched the sky with intention well before we knew, right? We knew anything in this age. Okay. So 17,000 years later, they painted the Bull of Taurus and Pleiades star cluster on a wall in a cave in what is now France. Okay. And then next we have in China, astrological activity dates back to the 5th millennium BCE. And the most concentrated astronomical events of the world came from ancient Mesopotamia. Okay. So 3000 BCE, Babylonian astrologers had mapped the constellations. They had determined the length of the lunar cycle, which was a little over 29 days. They had charted the cycle of Venus. They had marked the appearances of comets, of meteors. They started to study rainbows and storms and cloud formations. And what they're trying to do is determine the correlation between celestial happenings and the events that were happening on Earth. Now, during the 2nd millennium BCE, they recorded their findings on a dozen of clay tablets, collectively known as the Enuma, Anu, Enlil, which just translates to Win, Anu, and Enlil. This refers to the sky gods, who are the Anunnaki gods, Anu, and his son Enlil, who is the lord of air and weather. And they basically used this astrology back then as like a collection of useful omens. But it had nothing to do with a person on an individual level. Okay. So based on what they would see in the sky, that would determine what was going to happen in the land. Okay. So let me give you some examples. So when Jupiter went behind the moon, they knew that there was going to be hostility in the land. When Venus illuminates the breast of Scorpio, then rain and floods would ravish the lands. When Mercury is visible in Kislev, there will be robbers in the land. When Mercury approaches Spica, the crops in the land will prosper. The cattle will be numerous in the fields, and the king will grow strong. So abundance of everything. Sesame seeds and dates will prosper. So they actually used to consider the signs in the sky as messages from the gods. But they were more surrounded around political or weather related things. They were surrounded around war and peace, plague and famine. And they told stories of catastrophe or prosperity, but it wasn't for personal use unless they were talking about the king. Okay. Because we realize that when the sun enters Aries, right, which is springtime, when the sun is at its best, living his best life at its highest capacity, right? Because then we can feel the heat. They knew that abundance was going to come, which also meant that the king was going to be abundant as well. Okay. That's what they believed. Now, the middle of the 1st century BCE, they had settled on what we would consider to be the 12 zodiacs. So they recognized 12 constellations opposed to 18. They knew about 18, but they only recognized 12 of them. And they identified the ecliptic path of the sun and divided it into 12 sections, each 30 degrees long. Okay. That allowed them to create the signs, which are different from the constellations, but each equal in duration, length, and value. So modern astrology was actually created in ancient Babylonia. Okay, because this is when it happened, the middle of the 1st century BCE. Now, astrologers were called Chaldeans because there was an area called Chaldea, and it was a small area in the southeast where they recorded eclipses and celestial events, which eventually became a part of Babylonia later. So in 539 BC, Persians conquered Mesopotamia, and later Alexander the Great, who was Greek, conquered all of it. Now, one thing about Alexander the Great is that when he passed away, he had multiple lands, and he basically gave them to his friends, who were like, I think it was like 5 or 6 people. But Ptolemy, who is actually made the most contributions when it came to astrology, actually they believed he was related to or a half brother of him. And if he's not a half brother, he just was a really good friend. He's the one who inherited Alexandria, which is an area in Egypt that was conquered by Alexander the Great because he wanted the Greek people to have a place to call home, a place of advancement in a stronghold in Egypt. Okay. So the people who lived in Alexandria, which played a huge part in Egyptian history, were actually Greek people. Okay. So these invasions were about culture and colonization, or assimilating everyone to one language. Okay. So Egyptian astrology gave rise to a calendar and based things on what was rising, whether it would be a star or a constellation. Okay. So the ascendant, the descendant, that came from Egyptian astrology, but also keep in mind that they might have been Greek in origin. Okay. So Babylonian astrology provided the zodiac, planetary movement, and the idea that the planets were gods. Okay. Because they actually used to believe, if you look up any documentaries on ancient Egypt and the sun worship, they let you know that the Egyptians considered the sun to be like God, not God itself, but like God, because when the sun was in its highest vibration, right, in spring and summertime, it would bring prosperity. Okay. So the Greeks actually valued astronomy and mathematics, and they soaked it up. Plato also became interested and started studying it in his old age with a Chaldean. So he hired what we would call an astrologer, astronomer, and they started to teach him about this. And he actually started to, listen and soak this information up. Now, the Greeks became interested in astrology because they deemed it as having structure and based on precise measurements like math and astronomy. They considered it to be very scientific and rational, and the intellectual class actually accepted it in full. But it took a while for common folks to accept it and for it to trickle down to them. So next in this cycle was this island called Kos, and it was around about 280 BCE. And there was a guy named Berosus. He was considered to be the priest of Bel Marduk. And what he did is he created a school of astrology, and they started to provide individual horoscopes to all of the common people. Like, this man was so admired that the citizens of Athens, Greece, made a statue in his honor with a golden tongue. Okay, so this is the first time in history that astrology, astronomy, whatever you want to call it, trickled down to the common folks. Okay, so the most important astrology contribution came from the Egyptian by the name of Claudius Ptolemy. He was born around 100 CE. We already talked about him a little bit when we talked about Alexander the Great. We're going to talk about him later on in this episode in great detail. Okay, he wrote 2 books. One had instructions on how to determine planetary and house positions. Okay. So the structure of the way that we look at astrology in today actually comes from Claudius Ptolemy. All right. And the next is that he wrote this book called the Tetrabiblos, and that actually translates to in 4 parts. Right. But this is the most important astrology book ever written. And it actually was considered to be the Bible of astrology. Okay. And in this book, it included elements. It included fixed stars, meaning like the stars that are fixed in the sky, the astrology of nations, like how astrology was affecting nations, right? So we say about 250 years before a nation falls, like he was the one who was talking about this information: birth defects, parents, brothers, sisters, twins, diseases, death, and more. He was able to take astrology and determine those things for other people. As of the late 17th century, the Tetris Biblos was being taught in universities and again was described as the Bible of astrology. Now, in the Roman Empire, astrology and divination were so pivotal that they paid attention to comets, dreams, lightnings, snakes, lamps, laughing statues, decapitated statues, the direction that trees were growing in, birds, and what it was that they were actually superstitious of astrology, right? However, they had started to believe that there were no coincidences and that everything had a meaning. So they were paying attention to everything as like good and bad omens. Okay. Even though they were suspicious, though, they still consulted astrologers on a regular basis. So let's talk about 2 people when we're talking about the Roman Empire who played a pivotal part in this. First was Augustus, and Augustus was the adopted son of Caesar, who was very skeptical of astrology until he had his horoscope read by an astrologer, and the astrologer threw his feet at him because he saw good fortune and he saw all this stuff. So Augustus published his horoscope so that everybody can see it, because of course that was an ego boost for him, and we were so in our ego then. And then he made coins with the symbol of Capricorn on them, which really, really upset historians because they felt like there is no proof that you can predict somebody's life cycle based off the stars. There's no proof that people hold this specific energy, and we can still feel this energy that those historians felt to this day. Okay. So after Augustus was Tiberius, and this man was a fucking tyrant. Okay. He believed in astrology. He just didn't believe in astrologists. Okay. So he would test them and he would take them to the top of the highest fucking mountain, make them read his horoscope. And if he did not like what they had to say, he would push them off the fucking cliff. So he himself wouldn't push them, but he would have like one of those big ass guys who used to have a black mask and used to be like, off with his head. And he pulled the damn string.
White man down! White man down!
He would have somebody of that fucking mass with him, and they would just push these people off the cliff. So being an astrologer actually was very, very dangerous. It was a dangerous job to have because they wanted the information, but if they didn't like the information, they thought that you were the problem and not the information that they were receiving. They didn't seek to understand the information because it challenged their ability to stay comfortable. So they would just deem that you was lying and just off with his head, push him off a cliff. Okay. So the Romans were actually fascinated by astrology, but suspicious of it for a long period of time. And they would just dispose of anybody who would tell them information that they didn't want to hear. Okay. Now, the belief of astrology was almost universal at this time, but they had no job security. And as Christianity started to rise, astrology started to fall, especially after Constantine, who converted to Christianity in 312 CE. Now, Constantine is actually the reason why people don't go to church on the Sabbath day and they do it on Sunday, the day of the sun. He made a lot of changes when it came to certain things, but he also demonized astrology and any ancient practices that didn't go along with his belief system in Christianity because he wanted everybody to be under one God. And if you look at ancient teachings, they have multiple gods, right? Because the gods actually represent the planets. But he didn't understand that because, again, we're at a low level of consciousness and we only can perceive what we have experienced, right? So he demonized all ancient practices. They were outlawed along with astrology and divination, and deemed paganism as like a thought process that denies free will. Okay. Now, paganism is just working with the elements, earth, air, fire, water, to manifest whatever it is that you want to bring into this reality. So what we would consider to be witchcraft, those things actually date back to ancient Egypt and Thoth, who was the god of wisdom, the deity of witchcraft, the deity of astrology, tarot, any tools of divination. So everything that had to do with that was demonized with Augustine, because those things took you within spirituality, and he was trying to convert people to an external God, which was Christianity. Okay, there's a God that lives outside of you that you must obey. Okay. Now, around 364 CE, an assembly of clerics, meaning like churchgoers, condemned magic and astrology. Even St. Augustine, who converted to Christianity in 386 CE, piled on. They said that the Christmas star held the end of astrology, but they were wrong, because people continued to practice astrology. People continued to hire astrologists on their staff. They thought that it was going to be eradicated altogether, and it wasn't. Now, after the Roman Empire fell, we had the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Now, Muslim religious leaders, poets, and philosophers attacked and condemned astrology because they felt like no one could predict someone's future but God, even though people still had astrologers on their payroll. Okay. Next is the 9th century. There was an astrology school that was made. In the 11th century, they made a textbook on astrology that was different than the Tetros Biblos. And then 8th through 13th century, they made tremendous advancements, especially with the invention of algebra. But the most important work was translations from Greek, Persian, and Indian and Arabic astrologers, astronomers, whatever, philosophers. A lot of this was lost, but the translations kept it alive. Okay, a lot of translations in Arabic actually helped us to keep this information alive. Okay, so about the 12th century, they translated the Tetrabiblos into Arabic, and the rise of astrology started again. Universities offered classes in astrology and medicine. Because astrology actually was required for you to become a medical practitioner. You had to understand astrology. And European kings sought counsel of Arabic astrologers. Medieval life was immersed in astrology. Whenever a catastrophe event would happen, they would ask astrologers to look into it. For example, when the Black Death happened in 1348 in Europe, we're talking about the bubonic plague. It wiped out a third of the population. Now, the King of France asked them to look into it and found that the bubonic plague was because of the conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in March of 1335. A lunar eclipse that same month heightened the cosmic maleficence. Okay, this was a widely accepted concept. Okay, so astrology was supported through funding, which benefited the development of additional astronomical research like celestial navigation that included eclipses, retrograde motion, sidereal time, planetary ingress, mean and position of nodes of the moon, phases of the moon, and the position of minor celestial bodies like Chiron. Okay, Astronomia, which is what they called astrology and astronomy back in the day when they were one, was the name used to describe both astrology and astronomy, and dates back to ancient Mesopotamia, making it the most, again, ancient science that we have. Astronomia consists of two root words, astro or astra, often called astron as well, meaning star, and nomos, meaning law. Okay, so astronomia means the law of the stars. Okay. And when you learn Latin, every word in existence just makes more sense, because the word is the thing. It's the definition. Okay. Because words hold frequency, right? Aristotle actually started using a word called astrologia, which refers to the science of astronomy. So medieval scholars believe that astronomia, along with geometry, which is the study of shapes and numbers combined, were connected to the divine. So the medieval scholars of the 13th century believed that there was something divine and perfect that had to do with circles, which, when you think about astrology specifically, the zodiacs are made up of 360 degrees collectively, or a circle, each divided into each specific zodiac divided into 30 degrees of that circle. We have 12 of them. That's 360 degrees. That's a circle, right? So there is a correlation between astronomia and geometry. Now, astronomia was originally considered to be one of the 7 liberal arts. Most rulers and kings had astrologers on staff to help them make decisions that were astrologically aligned, but it was a dangerous job to have due to skepticism. Medieval students were required to learn astrology because it was commonly used in medical practice. Astronomy and astrology have been considered to be completely separate beginning in the 17th century and completely separate by the 19th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, astronomy was considered a major science that was a part of the Enlightenment model, which used the scientific method and it was completely accepted, while astrology was demonized. Okay. So next we're going to talk about specific astrologers that played a part in the development that happened between astrology and astronomy. So the first that we're going to talk about is Plato. Now, Plato was born between 428 to 348 BCE. Now, BCE just means before the Common Era. Okay, so before Plato, the Greeks actually worshiped the celestial bodies as gods like the ancient Egyptians. But the tension happening during and after the war between Athens and Sparta started to create doubt between their old beliefs, so the old gods and customs that they had, and they started to execute everyone that they believed caused this doubt, and that included Socrates, who was executed for the advancement that he was trying to make in the science of ethics. Okay, because philosophy is broken into three parts: it's logic, ethics, and physics. So because he was asking questions about morality, they ended up trying to execute him. Now, he actually did have a certain set of belief systems about astrology. People are very skeptical about that because there are no works by Socrates. The only thing that we know is that there are several other of his followers and students who wrote apologies to Socrates after he had died and he was executed. And in those, they would record conversations that they've had between Socrates and publish those conversations. So Plato played a significant part in this. And there was another guy named, it's like Xenophon or something like that. But there were a bunch of his students who came out basically trying to keep his work alive after his death. So there's skepticism around on what's true and what's not true. Okay. So Plato was a student of Socrates. Socrates was around between 470 and 399 BCE. Okay. Plato was one of his students, and he wrote on his behalf stating that a divine order did exist and that the gods were very much alive, but they have just manifested themselves into the cosmos. Obviously, he's speaking about Astronomia. He implored people to study and understand the stars and their rhythm to get in touch with the divine. Otherwise, he's basically saying that people were leaving it up to chance. Okay. And when he started coming out with these writings and he started coming out with these conversations, they were actually widely accepted because he was respected as a philosopher, as a scientist. Okay. So he said that people have to seek to understand the laws of the cosmos. He merged astronomy with what they called star-based divination or astrology using mathematics and numerical values, which was based off the findings of the ancient Chaldeans. He also associated the gods with planets, which still persists today if you look at Venus, which is associated with a woman and beauty, and Mars, which is associated with men and war.
That because you're from Venus and your mother's from Venus, so I don't see why I should have to talk to her.
My mother is not from Venus.
Of course she's from Venus. That's the point. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
My mother is not from Venus.
No.
Applying the numerical value in mathematics to the stars helped to develop spherical geometry and enabled astronomers to make accurate predictions about future events. The Chaldeans' study of astrology was on a macrocosmic level, meaning the universe, while Greek astrology was individual and on the microcosmic level, meaning man, individual. Now, Chaldean astronomy was observational, while Greek astronomy was mathematical, and they had a lot of models. Plato believed that our soul came from the stars and would return to the stars after death. After Plato's was Aristotle. Aristotle was around from 384 to 322 BCE, and he was a student of Plato. And a lot of his ideologies about the cosmos evolved from Plato's dialogue called Timaeus. Is Timaeus, but he was very well versed in so many different topics and sciences. And he believed that we lived in a geocentric Earth where the sun, moon, and other planets move around the Earth in a successive or crystalline sphere. He believed that the celestial bodies are not compounds of the four elements: earth, air, water, fire, but made up of the fifth element, which he called quintessence. He also believed that heavenly bodies had souls or contained supernatural intelligence which guide their motion throughout the universe, meaning that he believed that the planets held consciousness. Aristotle is considered the first notable scientist in history. He was a teacher of Alexander the Great, who is either related to or really good friends with Ptolemy the First. Okay, we're going to talk about Ptolemy in just a second. Then we have Aristarchus of Samos. He was around 310 to 230 BC. BC is before Christ. He created the first known map of the solar system, which was heliocentric, meaning the sun was at the center of the universe and the planets moved around the sun. Okay. You can see why that is a great contribution. He was not believed in his time that this was true. Him and the person who came after him were not believed. It wasn't until the third person, actually, I think the fourth person, that they actually started to believe the sun was at the center of the universe. Then we have Eratosthenes, who is around 276 to 194 BC. He was the head librarian of the Library of Alexandria. He calculated the distance between the sun and the earth. He also presented the need for a leap day through his studies of the Earth's axis. Then we have Hipparchus, who is around 190 to 120 BC. He founded trigonometry and spherical trigonometry, which were used to develop theories of lunar motion, and he was the first person to accurately predict solar eclipses. This led to him being the first person to create models that describe the motion of the sun and the moon. He also accidentally discovered the precession of the equinox and created the first star catalog. So next we have Ptolemy, and Ptolemy is going to come up so much in our studies because he actually made great contributions when it comes to astrology. Like I said, he did the Tetris Biblos, and he had another book he had written. Now, he was an Egyptian astronomer, mathematician, and geographer whose ethnicity was Greek descent. He was around during the 2nd century CE in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is in Egypt, but it was founded by Alexander the Great, who wanted Greek land and Egyptian territory that was named after him, hence the name Alexandria. Alexandria was on the Egyptian coast in a village called Rhakotis, which had been there since the 13th century BC. It was supposed to be a major center for trade in Greek culture, and it definitely was given what it was supposed to have gave, because that's what it became after the death of Alexander. So after Alexander's death, Ptolemy, who was his general, stole his body and brought his body back to Alexandria, where he built a golden tomb for him and put him in it, and that tomb has still never been found. And then he built what became the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, this kingdom went on to rule Egypt for over 300 years, which turned Alexandria into Alexander the Great's wildest dreams. The city became more prosperous than Athens, Greece itself. And it was the last dynasty to rule Egypt, because Cleopatra actually comes from Ptolemy's lineage. Okay, that's why a lot of her brothers were Ptolemies. There were a lot of Ptolemies. Okay, so most people know Alexandria because of the famous Library of Alexandria, which was burned in a fire. It was the most prominent library in ancient world, housing over 5,000 to 7,000 book scrolls. The goal was to gather every book in creation. And like I said, Ptolemy would have all texts seized when someone would come to Alexandria and give them back copies and keep the originals. Now, Ptolemy also is known for the Ptolemaic system, which was an expansion of Eudoxus' geocentric model, which put the Earth at the center of the universe and stationary with the planets, the sun, the moon, and constellation stars moving around it. He also added epicycles to explain the retrograde motion of Mars. Okay, so they did believe that the Earth was in the center of the universe and that everything was revolving around the Earth, and it wasn't until later that we found out that the sun was at the center. Okay. So before this model, the ancients believed that the heavenly bodies, which are the sun, moon, planets, and stars, traveled in a uniform motion in a perfect circle. But Ptolemy realized that the path was not perfect, and he used mathematics to cultivate an accurate model. This model persisted into the 16th and 17th century when Copernicus' system came out, and Copernicus was the one who said the sun is at the center of the universe and every planet is moving around it. He was not the first. He actually wasn't even believed when he said it originally. The next person to say it was Galileo Galilei. They didn't believe him either. The church actually put him on house arrest for 9 years. It wasn't until 2 millenniums after his death that they started believing that the sun was at the center of the universe. Okay. And then we had Kepler's law of planetary motion, which described the motion of planets in the solar system that came about as well. Next we have Aryabhata, and he was around 476 through 550 AD. He determined that Earth rotates around its axis once a day, and that Earth's rotation is the reason that we see the stars and moons move through the night sky. He also determined the correct length of each day and year. Nicholas Copernicus was around 1473 through 1543. He is the astronomer that proved that the celestial objects were not moving around the Earth. He is the reason that we understand how the universe is structured today, even though he was not believed until 100 years after his death. Galileo Galilei was around 1564 to 1642. He helped to develop the telescope, the pendulum clock, and the scientific method, and made integral contributions to science of motion by proving that all falling objects fall at the same rate regardless of size. He also discovered Jupiter's 4 biggest moons, which are named after him. He popularized Copernicus's heliocentric model and was forced by the Catholic Church to recant his statements, and they put him on house arrest for 9 years because of this. And then we have Isaac Newton, who is around 1642 through 1727. He is another one whose work almost went unnoticed. He invented calculus, the 3 universal laws of motion, and proposed the theory of universal gravity. Other notables were Tycho Brahe, who developed instruments to help develop the accurate position of 777 fixed stars. And then we have Johannes Kepler, who figured out that there are 3 pivotal laws of planetary motion. Planets move in an elliptic orbit around the sun. He came up with the area law and the harmonic law as well. So in conclusion, in ancient Babylon, which was known for astrology, there was no distinction between predictors and interpreters of celestial phenomenon. That doesn't mean they didn't consider them to be separate, just that both tasks were done by the same person, okay? There was no difference between astrology and astronomy. In ancient Greece, Eudoxus, who was a student of Plato, developed a geocentric model, which was accepted by greats like Aristotle. Aristotle expanded upon the model, but it was still criticized because he could not predict the path accurately or explain retrograde motion. A lot of our philosophers back in the day believed that the Earth was at the center, okay? That's what we need to understand. Ptolemy came along and added epicycles and explained the retrograde motion of Mars specifically. The first heliocentric model was proposed around 250 BC, but was not accepted until almost 2 millennia after with Copernicus, which again, they didn't even accept that until 100 years after he died. Plato and the Platonic school advocated for the study of astronomy as part of philosophy, which translates to the love of wisdom. It included ethics, ethicus, the study of moral phenomenon, physics, physica, the study of matter in natural science, and logic, logica, the study of speech and reasoning. He believed that the study of the stars revealed the cosmos had harmony and order. In the 3rd century BC, Babylonian astrology started to rise in Greece. Hellenistic philosophers, and the Hellenistic period is the period between the death of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra's reign, okay? So Hellenistic philosophers like Carnatus and Panaratus were skeptical and criticized it, but the concept of the great year, where all planets complete a full cycle or a circle and return to relative points in space, this idea that all events in the universe will recur indefinitely, called the eternal return. These concepts come from Stoics and are pivotal in divination, the art of predicting future events, and fatalism practices, the concept of things happening because of fate, and that some events are inevitable. Even though these Hellenistic philosophers were actually skeptical of astrology, they did believe in the great year. They did believe that everything returns to the same point, that everything goes through cycles, and that understanding these concepts were really, really important for us to understand how to predict future events and also understand fate. Okay, so during the Hellenistic period, astronomia and astrology were used interchangeably because they did consider them to be different conceptually. Plato taught astronomia and taught that planetary movement and phenomenon should be looked at mathematically, which led to his student Eudoxus proposing a solution, which we talked about previously, the geocentric model. Aristotle preferred the physical approach and used the word astrologia. Epicycles and elliptic cycles were looked at as useful but fiction because they had not been proven without a doubt. The Babylonians called it horoscopic, and they used words like apodalism, meaning effects or the study of the horoscope, and katarsh, which is a Greek word which means beginning or inception, referring to the right time to begin something. But most people followed Aristotle in using astrologia. The separation came with the book of Etymologia, which is like etymology, by Isidore Savelle, and later appeared in Arabic texts as well. Isidore referred to the distinction as astrologia naturalis and astrologia superstitios. Okay, so the naturalist would be astronomy and the superstitios would be astrology. Astrology was pretty much accepted fully in medieval Europe. They actually translated astrological texts from Arabic and Hellenistic astrologers. Although many kings and rulers had astrologers on staff, there was still skepticism surrounding the concept, and being an astronomer was a dangerous job. It was during this time of Francis Bacon when astrology was rejected as a science. The split took place in the West in the 17th and 18th century, which was the Age of Reason, when the elite deemed astrology as superstitious and occult science. Most astrologers today look at it as a form of divination, like I Ching, human design, and tarot. Okay. So I say all of this to say this, guys. The way that we feel about astrology, and how astrology has been deemed as witchcraft and as an occultist practice, that actually comes from people who were trying to push the concept of Christianity. We have to understand that they were trying to get people under one order, and they were trying to create what they call the Bible as an oppressive tool to get people to cooperate and fall under their priest and their preachers, right? Because they were trying to shift us from this dynamic of freedom and put us under one God, right? Under one rule. And the only way for them to do that was to change the way that we were already doing things and to demonize the things that we were already doing, because those things stood in their way. Okay, so you're not wrong in feeling like astrology is witchcraft and that you don't want to learn astrology because you think you're going against God. Okay, you have to first unpack your relationship with Christianity, which is what we're going to do in the next episode. But all of these things are related. Okay, and there are people who told you this information, and it has been passed down through your genetics, after line after line after line, meaning bloodline after bloodline after bloodline. Okay, so there's a reason why you feel this, but I urge everybody to please do your own research. Okay, if you look this stuff up and you actually try to gain the knowledge, you will come to the truth. But you're not going to do that until you stop being scared. Okay, on the other side of fear, if you want to conquer your fears, you have to gain more knowledge. Because with knowledge comes power. That power is called wisdom. And wisdom is just the application of what you know and what you understand to be true. But you first have to have the courage to go looking for the correct answers. I know that makes you feel uncomfortable because that means that what you have been told might have been a lie. Okay, and that you're the victim of something. But guess what? We all are. We all are. Okay? They conditioned us through the education system, through religion. There is supposed to be a separation between the two, but they're all this talking about the same thing. And you're not going to know the truth until you go looking for it. So if you are interested in that, please stay with me when it comes to this series. I promise. Follow me. I know the way.
Follow me. I know the way.
I'm not here to judge anybody because I understand what was done. Okay. And it was a strategic plan and it was an effective plan. The plan actually fucking worked. A lot of y'all feel the way that y'all feel about astrology because somebody sat down in the room and said, yeah, this is going to kind of go against what I want to happen. So we're going to say that this is the devil, that any tools of divination, anything that can lead to internal wisdom, we're actually going to say that that's wrong because we need them to look externally. And if we can keep their attention externally, they'll never find the truth. They'll never ascend, and we can keep feeding off of their energy. Okay. You owe it to yourself to just learn about this. You can even go into it with all the hatred in the world. But there are so many people throughout history who have tried to come forward and tell us the truth, and they were demonized and they were killed and they were put on house arrest and parodies and fucking the reason why part of what we have in the arts is that they would make comedy shows about them and they would publicly humiliate these people only to find out 1,000 years later, 100 years later, 2 millennia later, that it actually was the truth and that these people were trying to help them. Okay, so you owe it to yourself. We're in the age of Aquarius that is about the truth. Okay, the truth is going to come to light. The only difference is how comfortable you are when it's happening. If you refuse to change and you refuse to learn, you're going to live in a state of pain and suffering. But if you try to get ahead of this and you start looking at the information and you start going on this journey, it will make it a lot easier transition for you. Okay. And I'm just here to help you and to love you. Okay. So thank you for tuning in to another episode. I love y'all deep. Happy healing, friends. I'll see y'all next week.